Good morning. Let us begin. Does anyone have any question before we start? Any concern? So on Monday, I received a couple of complaints from some of the students, and also I've received some emails where students are saying that they have some conflict with the available SI sessions that are currently available. So what I have done is that I have requested my SI leaders to write back to me with all their various SI sessions on different dates, and I will compile those today, and I will send you that list of time slots that are being offered by different SI leaders. And I want you guys to choose, give me 1, 2, 3 options that you want to choose, which you can actually go to. And I will forward that information to my SI leaders, and hopefully that will resolve some of your problems. If by Friday you cannot really get into an SI session by resolving your time conflict, please let me know. We have probably then by Friday we need to really sit down and figure out this issue, because your SI sessions are important. What else? Today we are going to try to finish chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a very lengthy chapter. There are a lot of new things that we are learning from chapter 2. We already have seen this idea of production possibility frontier, which is a way to really capture the idea of how a society allocates its resources. Then we spend time looking at this idea of comparative advantage, which is the basis of why countries or individuals or firms trade with each other. So we wanted to understand the basic intuition behind trade. We will finish that today by sort of do a very quick review on the idea of trade. Then we are going to look at a more formal model of the economy, which is sometimes called circular flow diagram, another graphical tool or a graphical model that gives you a very good visualization of how an economy looks like. And when we talk about that, we are going to bring Samuelson back again. Samuelson is a very important and influential figure in the study of undergraduate economics course. We will try to finish today's class by talking a little bit about the market, the free market, and what are the benefits of having a free market, or why do we always talk about having a free market? What are the benefits? And what does free market give us that other kinds of market system cannot? If we can successfully finish chapter 2 today, I will upload the first quiz and the first homework, and it will be due next Wednesday. Okay? Any question before we start? So without further delay, let us look at the problem that we sort of tried to finish in the last class, where we were trying to understand how individuals or countries or firms specialize based on their comparative advantage. And we talked about these two ideas. One was this idea of absolute advantage, where one country or one individual can be better than everyone else in terms of everything. That would be an absolute advantage. When a single individual country has absolute advantage, it really cannot explain why that country should trade with other countries. So we need to have a second theory about how trade could occur. So we were looking at this example between two people, you and your neighbor. Based on the numbers, you can see that your neighbor is better than more productive than you in terms of everything that he does. So your neighbor actually has an absolute advantage. But then we said that trade is not based on absolute advantage. Trade is based on what we call comparative advantage, where we calculated the opportunity cost of various activities, and we figured out that everyone has a comparative advantage in this problem. When you are dealing with two people, two countries, it will always be the case, and it will always be the case, that one person or one country has competitive advantage in one, and the other country or the other person have competitive advantage on the other, so that they can trade. In this particular case, I guess the competitive advantage was that you had a competitive advantage in picking apples, your neighbor had a competitive advantage in picking cherries. So the second theory that we introduced in the last class, which was the theory of comparative advantage, which says that countries or individuals should specialize according to their comparative advantage, meaning that they should abandon doing everything else, just focus on the production of goods for which they have a comparative advantage. Comparative advantage results from a situation where you can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than your competitors. So we identified in the last class that you can pick apples at a lower opportunity cost, so you have the competitive advantage in picking up apples. Your neighbor has a competitive advantage in the picking of cherries. So what we did after that was very important, is that we showed that based on competitive advantage, both of these individuals can specialize. You can specialize in picking apples, your neighbor can specialize in the picking of cherries. But that doesn't really solve the problem of whether trade is beneficial to everyone. We argued that competitive advantage can tell us how we specialize, but in order for trade to happen between two people or two countries, we need to show that this trade is benefiting everyone involved. So we have to somehow show that individuals, in this case you and the neighbor, are better off after specialization and trade before compared to when they were not trading at all. Now you can look at that in two ways. First of all, the picture that we're looking at is much more instructive, but we mainly spent a lot of time looking at the numbers. And the numbers were summarized by this table. We actually calculated row 1, row 2, and row 3, where we showed that the amount of consumption of these two goods, apple and cherries, for both of these individuals, you and neighbor, changes before trade and after trade. What happens is that when these two individuals specialize and trade, it appears that both of them gains more of both of the goods. You gain an additional 2 apples, you gain an additional 3 cherries, your neighbor also gains more apples and more cherries. So what happens is that as a result of specialization and trade, both of you can consume beyond your production possibility frontier. And that is where the importance of trade lies in the sense that because of trade or through trade, you can consume combinations of goods and services which you could never produce in your own country. The picture is suggesting that. So in your case, A is where you are arbitrarily consuming before trade and specialization, and B is where you can consume after specialization and trade with your neighbor. And notice that B is not on your production possibility frontier. So just with the use of trade, you can consume at a point which is unattainable to you. Your neighbor is also doing the same thing. C is where the neighbor was arbitrarily producing before trade and specialization. When the neighbor decides to specialize according to his competitive advantage, which is cherry picking, and trade with you, your neighbor can literally consume at point D, which is beyond his production possibility frontier. So just like you, your neighbor can also consume a point which is unattainable to him. So trade can therefore allow us to consume goods and services or combination of goods and services which we cannot produce all by ourselves. So that's it. So there are a couple of slides in the presentation summarizes the discussion that we had before in the last class and today's class. I'm going to skip those. The slide will talk about absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and the slide will tell you how to calculate the opportunity cost table that we did in the last class. We did not draw a table, but we really calculated the numbers. And this is the table that really helps you to really identify competitive advantage. So the trick is, when you have a two-person, two good trade opportunity, you figure out the opportunity cost of each of these goods for each of these individuals and find out who has the lowest opportunity cost. So you can see clearly for apples, you have a lower opportunity cost because you are giving up only one cherries and your neighbor is giving up two. Similarly, your neighbor has a opportunity, has a lower opportunity cost in picking up cherries. So that's how you figure out comparative advantage. Okay, the next slide is also something that I'm going to ignore, sort of skip. It is going to give you a detailed description, and this is also in the book, where it talks about how people living inside a household really specializes in different things. They split their activities. Some people specialize on some activities of the family. Other people specialize on the other things. And that is very similar to what Robinson Crusoe and his friend Friday did in that island. So that's why the Robinson Crusoe story is so important and realistic. Okay, so some questions. Some questions that help us to sort of formalize our understanding. So let's see whether we can answer these. So let's look at this question. We're going to look at 4 problems today. Okay, so what's the answer? Yes, the answer is C, right? Why? Because the question is saying that if you have a comparative advantage in picking or producing apples, which means that according to Cowell's theory of comparative advantage, you are going to specialize on that. That means you are only going to produce apples, and that will place you on at a point such as point C. Right? Okay, so the answer is C. Let's skip that. Are we all clear on this? So if, on the other hand, the question was asking you, where would your neighbor produce if he has a comparative advantage in the production of cherries? So if your neighbor has a competitive advantage in the production or picking up cherries, your neighbor is going to specialize and he's going to only produce cherries, so he is going to be on the horizontal axis, just like you are on the vertical axis, the vertical intercept. Make sense? Okay. Let's look at this question. This is a sort of like a lengthy question with a lot of words, so please read them. Is everyone done reading the question? First of all, I want to point out the fact that this is sort of like the kind of problems that you face, in the sense that this is not a well-written question. The idea of economically appealing doesn't really make sense to me, right? What do you mean by something economically appealing, right? So one could have argued that this could lead to confusions, but hopefully we understand that this question is related to this trade stuff that we just talked about. So which one would be the correct answer? So B is saying that the USA would be better off if we specialize and then trade with some other countries, right? This is exactly the idea behind competitive advantage and why USA trades with China, right? So B makes perfect sense. Does any other answer make any sense at all? So let's look at A. The United States would be better off, self-sufficient, blah, 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 doesn't make any sense, right? Because this is talking about absolute advantage, where USA is trying to do everything all by itself, And we have just shown that if you try to do everything all by yourself versus you specialize on something and you trade, you can always go beyond your production possibility from here, right? So specialization and trade is always better than self-sufficiency. So A is not the correct answer. What about C?
It's just a restatement of A.
So C says we should produce at home the goods that we now import. That way we can generate additional jobs here at home. When you think about it, this is a very, very politically charged statement. And you will be surprised how many people think that this is true, right? Based on the limited amount of economics theory that we have introduced in this course, you know immediately that C is not right. Because whatever you want to produce really depends on your competitive advantage, right? According to the theory, if we believe that these theories make any sense, production decisions should always be motivated by your competitive advantage and not based on other non-economic considerations. Okay? D, we should establish trade with friendly countries and avoid trade with our enemies. This is a fairly serious statement, right? And we don't actually have sufficient tools to answer this question more rigorously. But you can understand that when you are thinking about in the context of economics, it's the difference between an enemy and a friend is very, very, it's not clear, right? So you can have political differences, but then you can have, some economic, common objectives that can make you a economic friend, right? Hopefully, some of you will have some, advanced interest in economics, where you will be taking some more advanced courses such as emerging economies or developing economies, where you will see that most of the countries in the world trade with both their enemies and friends at the same time, and that's probably one of the biggest irony of politics and economics. Okay. Next one. This is where the questions are going to become more and more relevant for your exam. So please take a look at this question. If you have some piece of paper, you should also try to calculate these by yourself, because you are going to be given very similar kind of time frame in your exam and also in your quiz. So which one is the correct answer? Okay, that is right, but let's do it anyway, right? Because we need to really be familiar with these concepts. Whenever you have questions like this that asks you to calculate or determine competitive advantage, you need to always calculate the table of opportunity cost. So what we are trying to do here is we are trying to figure out what is the opportunity cost for these two countries of producing food and clothing. Remember, opportunity cost is what you give up to produce something, right? So country A, when it produces 6 units of clothing, it is giving up 3 units of clothing, right? Do you all see that? So when it produces 1 unit of food, it is giving up half units of clothing, right? And that's the opportunity cost of food for country A. For country A, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of clothing is the 2 unit of food that it will give up. Are we all clear on this? For country B, when it is producing 1 unit of food, it is giving up 2 units of clothing. So for country B, the opportunity cost of food is 2 units of clothing. Remember, opportunity cost is always measured in terms of the good that you are giving up. So for country B, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of clothing is half unit of food. Okay, so now we look at the opportunity cost table and we figure out which country has lower opportunity cost in the production of a certain product. So we go by column. We look at the first column, we see clearly that country A has a lower opportunity cost in producing food. Then we move to column B, we see that country B has a lower opportunity cost in producing clothing. Therefore, country A has a competitive advantage in food, country B has a competitive advantage in clothing. So the correct answer is C. Makes sense. The next one. Okay, so what's the correct answer? Somebody said something. What is the correct answer? B. Let's do it anyway, right? So again, same idea. Now you are given the information not with a table but with a graph, but it's containing the same information. Let's look at country A. Country A can either produce 120 units of shirt or it can produce 120 units of chips, right? So we now calculate the opportunity cost again. So for country A, the opportunity cost of shirt is 1 unit of chip, right? And for country A, the opportunity cost of 1 unit of chip is 1 unit of shirt. So it's just 1 because of 120 and 120. They are perfect substitutes for the production side. For country B, the opportunity cost of 1 unit of shirt is, so it can either produce 108 shirts or 36 chips, right? So if it produces 100 shirts, 8 shirts, it gives off 36 chips. So for country B, the opportunity cost of a shirt is 36 divided by 108, which is 0.33. Right? Do we all see that? For country B, the opportunity cost of a chip is 108 divided by 336, which is 3. Okay? So we now have the 4 numbers. So again, we find competitive advantage based on who has the lower opportunity cost. So we first compare, find the competitive advantages for shirt. So country A has a competitive opportunity cost of 1 and country B has the opportunity cost of 0.33, right? Country B has a lower opportunity cost in making shirts. Do we all see that? 0.33 is less than 1. So country B has a competitive advantage in B. Now you really do not have to calculate the other one. You know that country A automatically has competitive advantage. Is it making sense? In this two good case, the other country will always have competitive advantage in the other one. So if country B has a competitive advantage in the production of shirts, A has competitive advantage in the production of chips. Okay? And you can see that the opportunity cost of 1 unit of chip is 1. The opportunity cost of 1 unit of chip for country B is 3. So country A has a lower opportunity cost. Are we all clear on this? So the correct answer is A. Okay? Any question? Okay, so that's sort of, I hope that it should have summarized what we have learned in the context of trade. We are now going to move to the next concept. So before we do that, let's do a quick review of what we have covered so far. In chapter 2, we have looked at 2 very important graphical tools that are somehow considered as graphical models. The very simplistic graphical models that we use in economics. One was the idea of a production possibility frontier, and the second one was this concept of theory, which is like a trade theory based on competitive advantage and absolute advantage. So these are very important building blocks towards our greater understanding of microeconomics. Now we are going to sort of formally introduce the first complete economic model that ever came out in an undergraduate textbook. And it is entirely due to one guy, Paul Samuelson. And we mentioned about him. He's the author of the first undergraduate textbook in economics. So around 1942, he was thinking about how he can teach economics to undergraduate students. His thought process led to a lot of innovations. And that has really revolutionized the way we teach economics to undergraduate students. And we are going to show you one of his finest contributions. Now, Samuelson was an economist. He was not a microeconomist. He was not a macroeconomist. His contribution to the economics is so large that he was considered for Nobel Prize more than once. And surprisingly, his first contribution for which he got a Nobel Prize was in the area of trade. He developed some really sophisticated theory, and then later on, around in the later part of his career, he was seriously considered to get a Nobel Prize in the context of macroeconomics. So Samuelson is this guy who is thinking about how he can introduce the concept of a market or an economy to an undergraduate student class. Because when you think about the economy, it's a very complex thing, right? And he knows that he cannot really bring the entire economy inside the class room and explain that to the undergraduate student. So as a scientist, he knew that he has to do two things. First of all, he needs to come up with a model for the economy, and the model has to be simple enough based on restrictive assumptions that he's going to impose that helps students to learn the critical elements about the actual economy, but at the same time ignore a lot of unimportant details for this level of study. So the model that we are going to look at is a unique way of looking at the economy. So let's try to follow his thought process, because that is very important to understand why the model that we're looking at makes a lot of sense. So Samuelson is thinking about developing a model that captures everything that happens in an economy. And that's a quite complicated process. So while he was thinking about how to model an economy, Samuelson realized several very critical things about an economy. First, he realized that if you think about an economy in general, you would realize that economy mainly consists of three things. Actually four, but we are going to ignore one of them. It consists of basically three things. He realized from the onset that, in every economy, there is this group who are buyers. They buy stuff, right? And there is a second group who are producers who produce stuff. So there is a buyer group, there is a producer group, and these two groups really interact with each other, and that's all the economy. That's all about the economy, right? They interact with each other in various different kinds of market. Every activity that is being performed in an economy, from his perspective and also from our perspective, is a market activity. So a market activity is when you are sitting in the classroom taking a class. A market activity is when I am delivering a class lecture. Market activity is something when you are making a pizza for yourself. These are all market activities, but not all markets are same. After making this very critical observation that our economy consists of this really two large group, consumers and producers, buyers and sellers, Samuelson realized that there is another layer of complication that needs to be resolved. And the complication is related to the kinds of markets that we see in an economy. Because in a real economy, there are thousands and thousands of different kinds of markets. There is a market for cattle where you buy actual live animal, and there is a market where you buy meat of the same animal, right? Are they all same? Now, again, as a scientist, he is thinking about how to simplify this complex thing. He's thinking that, well, although there are a lot of different kind of markets, all these markets really fall into two categories. One market, he argues, is a market where we buy final goods and services. Stuff that we can buy from the market and we can start using them. Like a can of milk, like a pizza, like a haircut. These are things that you buy which are readily available for your consumption. So that's one kind of market where you can buy final goods and services or final goods. And then there are markets where you buy raw materials. Right? For example, you could be buying flour from one market, make a pizza with that, and sell that pizza in a different market. Do we all see that? The market where you are going to sell the pizza is going to be the final market, goods market, where people are going to buy that pizza from you and take it home and eat. But the market that from where you are buying the flour is also important, right? Because that's the market where you buy raw materials from. So that simplification is also very important for us to understand about how the economy works. So Samuelson decided that he's going to have two different kinds of market in his model. He's going to have what we call a goods market, and then he's going to have something called a factor market. Goods market is going to be where final goods and services are going to be bought and sold, and factor market is going to be where raw materials are going to be bought and sold. So with this simplification, Samuelson came up with a very simple yet very deep economic model, which is called a circular flow diagram. What we're going to do now is look at the actual, the original version of the circular flow diagram model that Samuelson developed so many years ago. And obviously, immediately after explaining the model, we're going to criticize the major limitations of that model. Because yes, the model is too simple, and yes, the model ignores a lot of things. And we want to understand what things that model is ignoring. Before we look at that model, let us simply summarize the critical assumptions and critical observations made by Samuelson. He first observed that the economy can be divided into two groups, buyers and sellers, and the economy's markets can be divided into two kinds, factor market and good market. With that, you can literally define an economy where every economic activity is just a market activity, where either somebody is buying something or somebody is selling something. But another very important idea behind the circular flow diagram is that the markets, the two kinds of markets that we just talked about, are also different in terms of the participation. We have just said that the final goods market is where you buy final goods or ready-made goods, and factor market is where you buy raw materials, but also there is a difference between who is buying and who is selling. And that is also based on some assumptions that we are going to make. We're going to say that the final goods and services market, where you buy final goods, is a place where you, me, everyone else, which we will call household from now on, we are the buyer in that market. We go to that market with pockets full of money, we pay for those, we take it home, and we start using them. So the market where we buy these final goods, the households are going to be the buyer, and the farm is going to be the supplier or the seller, same thing. On the other market, the factor market, the role reverses. And we want to be absolutely certain that we understand that. Okay, so the other market is the factor market. So factor market is where you buy raw materials. So there are four major categories of raw materials, which we are going to formally define in a minute. But raw materials are raw materials, right? So who is buying those raw materials? Obviously, a household doesn't buy those, because household has no use for that, right? Are we all clear on that? By the way, if you are a household and you are buying flour to make a pizza and sell that pizza to a marketplace, you are not a household. You're a farm, right? Are we all clear on this? So this characterization of household and farms, they are kind of, arbitrary in the sense that the same person can be a farm and a household at the same time, right? It just depends on what kind of activities you are performing. So when Samuelson divided the economy in terms of a buyer and a seller, he was thinking about the group that buys things and the group that sells those things, right? And produces those things. In the factor market, the farm is going to be the buyer. The farm is going to buy the raw materials. The farm is going to buy also other stuff called factors of production. And the seller of those goods, raw material goods, are going to be the household. So the final good market and the factor market are fundamentally different in terms of the role of the buyer and the seller. In the final goods market, the household is the buyer and the farm is the seller. In the factor market, the farm is the buyer and the household is the seller. Before we formally look at the model, if you have any question, you can ask right now. Any questions so far? Okay. So, let's now formally start looking at the key ingredients of the Samuelson circular flow diagram model. We talked about households who provide the factors of production, and factors of productions are usually falls into 4 categories. Factors of productions are raw materials. So let's try to now look at, for the first time, this idea of production, which we are going to look at more deeply in future chapters. Production in economics involves producing something for the economy. That production could involve making a car, that production could involve giving you a haircut. But every production involves 2 critical elements. There are stuff that goes in and there are stuff that comes out. The stuff that goes in a production are called raw materials. Raw material is not an economic word. The formalized word that really tells the same story are called factors of production. Factors of production in economics are equivalent to raw materials. Factors of production, or in some cases just factors, can be of 4 different kinds. So let us try to understand this again from a production perspective. Let's imagine that you are producing shoes. You're a producer and you're making shoes. So what do you need? What do you need to make shoes? The first thing that you need are sort of raw materials like leather, or things that you need to make the lace and whatever. So you need some raw materials. Without raw material, most of the production cannot take place. Okay? Let's keep the raw material discussion a little bit later. The first thing that one could argue that you need to produce something is you need labor. Somebody to work in your production process. Are we all clear on that? So labor would be the first element and probably the most important element, because households are most of the times the labor in your production process. So you need labor, you need machines, right? You need machines that make the shoes. Again, machine is not an economic word. The economic word that substitutes machine is called a capital. Capital is the same thing what a machine does. But in a more advanced course, we are going to sort of distinguish between different kinds of capital. We are going to say that capital can also be of 2 kinds. Some capital is what you can see, like this computer is a capital. You are producing something with this. Like the machine that is being used to make a shoe is readily observable. It's a machine, it's a large thing. It's called a physical capital. And there could be capital that you cannot see, but are equally important in the production process, such as your experience, your skill. Make sense? Now, in this microeconomics course, rather than using the second term, which is called human capital, we are going to use a softer term for that. We are going to call that entrepreneurial ability, or just entrepreneurs. What we are disguising there are the stuff that are used in the production process, but there is no physical representation. You can see raw materials, you can obviously see a labor, right? You can see the machines, But then there are some other things that go into a production process that you don't see, like your planning, like somebody managing the production, right? So these are also part of the production process. We are going to call them entrepreneurial abilities. Okay, so we basically therefore have 4 different kinds of factors of production: labor, capital, raw materials, which we are not going to call raw materials. We are just going to call them natural resources. Right? There is a more common word for natural resources, which is used in economics and frequently confused with other people. We usually call natural resources just land, where land is obviously a natural resource, but when we talk about land in economics, we actually talk about all the natural resources that you use in the production process. So to put it simply, we actually use 3 kinds of factors of production: land, labor, and capital, where capital can be divided into 2 categories: physical capital and human capital. So there are basically 3 factors of production, and capital can be divided into 2, so there are basically 4 factors of production in any standard production process. Now, the question that we want to start with is that where do we get these factors of production? And in order to simplify our life, in order to simplify our model, we're going to assume, and it's an assumption, that households supply those factors of production. Households work as a labor. Households own the natural resources, which it sells to the farm. Household also owns the capital, which is kind of confusing, because when you think about capital, when you think about the machines, you think that it is the farm that is owning the machines, right? There are problems of having the farms owning those machines. It will ignore that complication for the time being and just assume that this is just an assumption. And we're going to assume that every factors of production are being owned by our household. They are sold by our household. They are supplied by our household to the farm. And the place where these factors of production are sold, supplied, is called the factor market. So in the factor market, our household is the supplier and our farm is the buyer. So together, these goods that farms buy from the household, the farm will take those factors of production from the factor market, combine them in their production process. They're going to produce something called a product or a good, and they're going to sell those to the product market. And the question is, who is going to buy those? In our model, for the sake of simplicity, we are going to assume that the household will buy those goods. So, just to review again, the product market is where the farm is going to be the seller and the household is going to be the buyer. And the factor market is where the household is going to be the seller and the farm is going to be the buyer. With these abstractions, assumptions, simplifications, we are now ready to look at our circular flow diagram, which actually is a circular flow, which actually has a circular flow. It shows the economy in a circular fashion. By using only 4 simplistic simplification of our economy, our circular flow diagram in its originality had only 2 agents in our economy. The reason why I call them agents, because I think that they act like agents. Agents are households and farms. These are the 2 groups that exist in economy, and these 2 agents really interact with each other in the product market and in the factor market. And their interaction really creates a circular flow of activities in our economy, and hence the model is called circular flow diagram. What is important for your exam is to understand the nature of this circular flow of activities. Because some activities go from farm to household, some activities go from household to farms. In order to highlight the importance of these different flows, Samuelson himself and all the later textbook had color-coded description of these activities. So let's follow this. In a circular flow diagram, the flow of activities can be divided into two categories. One would be the flow of physical goods and services, physical things that you can see, and the other one is going to be the flow of financial resources, right? So what is financial resources? They could be price, they could be, payments. These are all financial resources that you cannot eat or see, and then there are going to be flow of actual economic activities or physical activities. Okay, so let's start with the factor market, which is probably where most of the actions take place, right? So in the factor market, notice that the factor market is where our firm is going to buy labor, capital, and natural resources. Land, labor, and capital from our household. So the household is supplying, notice the direction of the arrow. The resources are coming from the household to the product firm market, factor market, and they are bought by our firms. Our firm is buying these things: labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability, you name it. All are factors of production for a firm. In return, our firm is also giving something to our households, right? We'll ignore that for the time being. First of all, we are now interested in looking at the flow of physical stuff going from one side of the market to another market. In the factor market, the physical stuff starts from household, goes to the firm, they are land, labor, and capital. Firm takes those land, labor, and capital, produces goods and services, sells them to the product market, where household buys those goods and services from the product market. Right? So, goods and services are generated or produced by firm. They sell it in the product market. Factors of production are produced or generated by household, and they are sold in the factor market. But this flow that we just looked at involves flow of physical resources or goods that we can see. Then there is a outer flow as well, and those flows are in terms of the financial resources. First of all, for their sale of factors of production in the product market, our household is going to receive wage and other payments. In this micro course, we are just talking about wage and other payments and not careful about different kinds of payments that exist. These payments are payments for the resources that the household is selling to the firm. Of those resources, the most important one is the labor, because our household is usually the only supplier of labor. For the supply of labor, our household receives something called wage, which is going to be the price of labor that the household sells. The household also sells other things like capital, like natural resources. The price of those are going to be called rents, R-E-N-T-S, which is not specified here, but we are going to specify that later on. Okay, so wages. Now notice the color has changed, it's green, and the financial resources are going from farms to households. Do we all see the connection? So the physical resources are going from household to farms, wages and the financial resources are going from farms to households. So this is a perfect market where things are being exchanged for a price. The similar kind of financial resources are going to play out in the product market as well, where the household who received the wages and other forms of payment from the firm treats these payments as his or her income and use those incomes to buy goods and services from the product market. So whenever a household goes to a product market, buys a can of Pepsi or a pizza, these are called spending on goods and services by our household on the goods that a firm produces. Okay? So we have 3 minutes. In that 3 minutes, let us just summarize the table. Okay? What we have just looked at is a very simplified and a very deep way of looking at an economy. It's called a circular flow diagram, where the economy is divided into two groups and two markets. Households are the suppliers of factors of production in this market. Firms are the buyers of factors of production in this market. Households are the buyer of final goods or products in this market. Firms are the suppliers of product in this market. Whenever these resources change hands, whenever household sells factors, it receives payments like wages and other forms of payment. Whenever a firm sells those goods that it produces, it receives spending on goods and services from the household. So the entire economy is connected by these two markets and these two agents, household and firms. Thank you very much.
Have a good day.